When humans repay a debt, even the oldest shadows in the galaxy tremble. Witness a story of courage, defiance, and unstoppable will. Captain Daniel Harris sat in the quiet of the observation deck, staring out into the endless stretch of stars, and wondering if history ever truly forgot the small things, or if time had a way of returning them to the surface no matter how much. Dust had settled over them, and in that silence he remembered the archive he had opened 2 nights before, a file so old that most officers on his ship would have ignored it. Yet he could not forget it now. Not after reading about the story of a handful of explorers from Earth who had once been lost in the void, their ship broken, their supplies gone, their hope drained until they were saved not by great powers or mighty empires, but by a small gentle race called the Talari, who had offered them food and shelter, who had asked for nothing, and who had expected nothing, and yet in that single act had planted something in the heart of humanity that would not die even centuries later. Daniel had thought about that story for days, letting it turn over in his mind while reports came in from across the colonies about trade disputes and mining shortages and the usual background noise of an expanding people. But those matters seemed pale against the news that had slipped quietly into his hands, a report that the Talari homeworld was under siege by the Dravari Empire, and that no one had lifted a finger to help them, not the Galactic Council, not their neighbors, not anyone. And Daniel felt a weight in his chest, because he knew the Talari could not stand alone, not against the Dravari, not against the most feared conquerors in known space. He sat with that weight until it drove him from his chair and into the council chamber of humanity itself, where the leaders of Earth and the colonies gathered in one great hall, their voices sharp, their tempers sharper as they debated endlessly about resources and treaties, and Daniel waited until he was given the floor. And then he spoke simply and without flourish, telling them of the Talari debt, telling them of the act that had once kept human lives from fading into the dark, and how now that same race was being erased by cruelty and indifference. And he said the words that would never leave the chamber: "We cannot walk away. If we walk away, then we are not human anymore." The room had fallen quiet after that sentence, a silence thick enough that every heart could hear its own beat. And though some of the leaders argued, still saying the Talari offered nothing, saying war with the Dravari meant ruin, saying the debt was too small to matter, others looked at Daniel with something that had not been seen in politics for a long time. Pride in the idea that humans were different. Pride in the idea that debts mattered, even if they were ancient, even if they were small. The vote was taken and the decision was made, and across Earth and Mars and the stations in orbit, around distant suns, the word spread. Humanity would fight. Humanity would march to repay the debt owed to the Talari, and soon the docking yards lit up with life, as engineers rushed to prepare the fleets, as factories roared, and as men and women lined up in numbers that startled even their own commanders. They were not going to war for land. They were not going for riches. They were going because of a promise, and that promise meant everything. Among those who answered the call was Jason Reed, a young pilot whose reckless grin hid the fear in his heart, but whose determination was stronger than steel. He had grown up on stories of explorers, of daring runs through asteroid fields of human courage, and he had always wanted to carve his name into those stories. Now he had his chance. He trained harder than ever, spent nights in the simulator until his eyes burned, and when his commander asked him why, he said simply, "Because they saved us once and now it is our turn." Linda Moore was different. She was an engineer who cared less for glory and more for machines. She loved the hum of engines, the whisper of reactors, the feel of a ship coming alive beneath her hands. She had lost family in old border skirmishes, and she carried scars that no one could see, but she believed in duty. And when she heard of the Talari, she felt something stir, because she knew what it was to be small and overlooked. And she promised herself that if human ships faced the Dravari, then those ships would hold together longer than anyone thought possible. Clara Brooks was a medic, and she had seen enough blood to last 10 lifetimes. She had served in refugee camps, watched children die in her arms, and carried the screams of the wounded into her dreams. Yet when the call came, she did not hesitate. She packed her medical bag quietly, kissed her sister goodbye, and boarded the Liberty without looking back. She did not fight with guns, but she knew she would be needed, because war always left its mark on flesh and bone, and someone had to be there to stitch it back together as the Liberty prepared to leave orbit. Daniel watched his crew move with purpose, and he felt the weight of responsibility press against him. He knew what they were marching into. He knew the Dravari were not an enemy to underestimate. They had crushed fleets that dwarfed humanity's. They had enslaved entire planets with barely a fight. They were a shadow across the stars, and yet Daniel also knew something else. He knew that humans were not like the others. Humans had a stubbornness that no empire could measure. They had an ability to rise from ashes, and they had a memory long enough to repay even the smallest of debts. The day the Liberty set sail, the launch was broadcast across the colonies. Crowds gathered on city streets to watch the ships rise. Families cheered. Soldiers saluted. Some wept because they knew not all would return. But the message was clear. Humanity was united, not by fear, not by greed, but by honor. The Galactic Council watched in disbelief, whispering among themselves that humans were reckless, that they were naive, that they would be crushed in days. But still the humans marched forward because they knew the Talari were waiting, and because they refused to let kindness die alone. When the Liberty and her escort reached the edge of Talari space, the sight that greeted them chilled every heart. The skies burned with fire. Dravari ships hung in orbit like vultures, talons stretched toward the fragile world below. The Talari cities were in ruins, their defenses shattered, their people desperate for aid. And for a moment silence fell on the Liberty's bridge as every officer took in the reality of what they had chosen to face. Then Daniel gave the order, "Engage," and the first human shots of the war streaked across the void. The battle that followed was chaos. Jason Reed dove his fighter through waves of enemy craft, weaving between bursts of fire and leaving wreckage in his wake. His heart pounded. His breath came ragged, but he did not stop because every second he fought was another second the Talari could breathe. Linda worked furiously in the engine room, patching systems as fast as they broke rerouting power through circuits that screamed with overloads, refusing to let the Liberty fall. Clara moved through smoke-filled corridors, tending to the wounded, ignoring the tremors that shook the ship around her as explosions tore through steel. Daniel stood on the command deck, his eyes fixed on the battle unfolding, knowing that this was only the beginning. The humans fought like demons, and the Dravari reeled in surprise, expecting easy prey but finding wolves instead. Ships that should have broken held together through sheer will. Fighters that should have fled drove straight into the storm, and slowly, impossibly, the tide turned. The Liberty's guns roared, and Dravari vessels fell one by one, and across the galaxy whispers began to spread that the impossible was happening, that the Dravari were being challenged by the youngest race of all. When the smoke cleared and the first battle was won, the Talari stood on their battered world, staring up at the human ships that hung like guardians in their sky. They had thought themselves abandoned. They had thought themselves forgotten. Yet now a fleet of strangers had come, not for conquest, not for wealth, but for them alone. And in that moment the Talari wept for joy, while across the stars the Dravari prepared their fury, knowing that what had begun here would not end quietly. And Daniel Harris knew too that this was only the first step of a war that would shake the galaxy, because when humans repay a debt, nothing can stand in their way. The news of the first battle spread faster than light across the stars, carried by whispers, rumors, and hurried transmissions. And for the first time in centuries, the Dravari found themselves facing not silence, not fear, not submission, but defiance, from a species too young to know its place and too stubborn to accept defeat. The Liberty and her escort had driven back the first fleet, and the Talari were alive. Their cities battered their skies, scarred but alive, and in those quiet hours after, the guns fell silent. The humans walked among them, offering aid, food, water, medicine, and for the Talari it felt like a miracle born out of fire, because no one had ever come for them before. No one had ever chosen to bleed for them. Daniel Harris stood on the surface of Talari Prime, watching children gather around Clara Brooks as she treated wounds with gentle hands, and he felt the weight of his decision press heavier than ever, for he knew this victory would not be forgotten by the Dravari. He knew they would return not with one fleet but with many. Not with arrogance, but with fury, and when they did, the real war would begin. Yet as he looked into the eyes of the Talari leaders, eyes filled with gratitude and disbelief, he also knew there was no turning back. Humanity had made its choice, and now they would see it through no matter the cost. The Galactic Council reacted with outrage and disbelief. Their chambers filled with raised voices as representatives of old empires shouted that humans had doomed themselves, that they had brought ruin upon their own heads for the sake of a weak and forgotten race. Some argued that humanity should be cast out from the council. Others demanded sanctions and threats, but none of it mattered, for humanity had already acted, and the galaxy could do nothing to undo it. Meanwhile, across Earth and her colonies, people watched the broadcasts of the Talari children waving at human soldiers, and they felt something stir deep inside, a pride that swelled stronger than fear. Mothers and fathers sent their sons and daughters with blessing. Volunteers filled the barracks, and the docks could barely keep up with the flow of new recruits. Humanity had never been so united. Jason Reed found himself restless in the days that followed the first battle. His hands itched to fly, his heart beat to the rhythm of engines. He walked through the Talari streets, still heavy with smoke and rubble, and he saw the way the people looked at him with awe and hope. And it frightened him more than any battle, because he was only one man, only one pilot, and yet in their eyes he was something greater. He returned to his fighter every day, running checks, making adjustments, whispering to the machine as though it were alive, promising it that together they would not fail. Linda Moore spent those days deep in the Liberty's belly, working with teams of Talari engineers who marveled at her skill. She showed them tricks of improvisation, ways to push machinery past its limits, and they showed her old technologies born from centuries of patience. It was a strange dance between desperation and creativity, and in the middle of it, Linda felt more alive than she had in years. She knew the storm was coming. Knew the Dravari would descend upon them like a tidal wave. But she also knew that when they did, the Liberty would be ready, stronger than before. Clara Brooks moved between field hospitals, her uniform stained with blood, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, but her hands never stopping. She listened to Talari children tell her stories. Between coughs, she held dying soldiers who whispered thanks. She taught young Talari medics how to stitch wounds, and she carried the quiet knowledge that many more would come soon. For every life saved, she knew another would be lost, yet she refused to let despair take root, because despair was what the Dravari wanted, and she would not give it to them. The calm before the storm did not last. The Dravari returned, not with one fleet, but with 3 vast armadas stretching across the stars, their ships like a wall of death. Their commanders sneered at the thought of humans, believing them little more than animals who had gotten lucky once. The Talari cowered, the council retreated into silence, and humanity stood alone at the edge of the abyss. Daniel Harris gathered his officers in the Liberty's command room, and his voice was steady as steel as he told them what lay ahead. He did not promise survival. He did not promise victory. He promised only that they would fight until the debt was paid, and every man and woman in that room nodded because they understood. The second great battle began in the skies above Talari Prime. The Dravari descended like a storm, and the Liberty's guns roared to meet them. Jason soared into the chaos, his fighter weaving through impossible gaps, blasting enemy ships apart with reckless precision. He shouted encouragement into his comms, laughing even as fire streaked past his wings, his joy a defiance against fear. Linda's modifications kept the Liberty alive. Systems that should have collapsed held together under her frantic hands. Clara ran from deck to deck, tending to the wounded, her lungs burning from smoke, her hands slick with blood. Daniel stood firm on the bridge, issuing orders with calm clarity, guiding his fleet like a conductor leading a symphony of war. The Dravari pressed harder, wave after wave crashing against the human line, and ships fell, burning into the void, but the humans did not break. They fought with a ferocity that stunned even their allies on the ground, and for every vessel lost, another rose to fill the gap. The Liberty took blow after blow, her hull groaning, her decks trembling, yet she held fast, and when the Dravari finally pulled back, it was not because they chose to retreat, but because they could not break the human wall. The Talari stood once more, watching the impossible unfold, but victory was not without cost. Jason returned to the hangar, his fighter scarred and smoking, his body bruised, his face streaked with sweat. Linda collapsed against a bulkhead, her hands shaking from exhaustion. Clara fell asleep beside the wounded, too tired to move. Daniel stared at the star map in silence, knowing that the Dravari would return again and again with more ships, more soldiers, more fury. He also knew that humanity could not hold forever. Not here, not alone. If the Talari were to survive, humanity would have to take the war beyond defense. They would have to strike back. Word of the battles spread far beyond the Talari system. Rebellions whispered in the shadows of Dravari rule. Oppressed worlds hearing that the unbreakable empire had been wounded. Alien leaders, who once mocked humanity, now watched in silence, fear mixing with awe because they realized something none had ever considered. Humanity was dangerous not because of their numbers, not because of their weapons, but because of their hearts. They fought, for reasons no one else understood. They fought for honor, for promises, for debts, and that made them unpredictable. In the days that followed, Daniel called his officers together once more and laid out the plan. Humanity would no longer wait for the Dravari to come. Humanity would carry the war to them. They would strike their supply lines, raid their outposts, shatter their confidence. They would show the galaxy that humans did not only defend, they attacked. And when they attacked, they did so with a fury that could not be contained. The officers listened, and though their faces were grim, their eyes burned with the same fire. They knew this was the only way forward. Jason trained harder than ever, pushing his body to its limits, flying until he could barely see straight. Linda rewired entire systems, creating weapons the Liberty had never carried before. Clara gathered her medics, teaching them how to move faster, treat quicker, save more lives. Daniel prepared himself for the speeches he would have to give to soldiers who might never come home. And when the Liberty left orbit again, the Talari gathered in the streets, watching in silence, some weeping, some cheering, all of them knowing that humanity had bound their fate to theirs, and that bond would not break. The next strikes were swift and brutal. Human fleets swept into Dravari space, hitting targets with precision and vanishing before the enemy could respond. Jason led squadrons through asteroid fields, turning the rocks themselves into weapons. Linda's designs allowed ships to fire faster and move quicker. Clara worked without rest, saving lives in cramped corridors lit by flickering lights. Daniel sent message after message across the stars, telling every human soldier that they were not fighting for conquest, they were fighting for a debt, and debts had to be paid. The words carried power, and the soldiers believed. The Dravari began to feel something they had never felt before: doubt. They crushed one rebellion, only for two more to rise. They destroyed one fleet, only for another to appear. They sent assassins and spies, but the humans adapted faster than they could predict. They began to whisper among themselves that humanity was not simply another enemy. Humanity was a plague, a storm, a fire that spread wherever it touched and could not be stopped. And in the dark corners of the galaxy, more and more voices whispered the same thing. The galaxy trembles because the humans have risen, and they will not fall. The war had only just begun, but already the shape of it had changed. Humanity was no longer defending the Talari. Humanity was teaching the galaxy what it meant to stand for something greater than survival. And though the cost grew higher, with every battle, though lives were lost in numbers too great to count, the fire in their hearts burned brighter than ever. Daniel knew the road ahead would be long and bloody, but he also knew this humanity had taken the first step on a path from which there was no return, and the Dravari would soon learn what it truly meant when humans repaid a debt. The galaxy had shifted in silence after the fall of the Zorath Dominion, yet peace was fragile, and more eyes turned toward Earth than ever before, some with fear, some with doubt, and some with curiosity. The human fleet returned from the last war, carrying scars of battles fought in the void, and minds heavy with what had been done among the officers. Captain Laura Stone stood quietly on the bridge of her ship, not speaking much, but always watching her crew. She had grown sharper since the campaign. Her gaze steady, her words measured the whispers, and the galaxy called her the Iron Captain. Though she never asked for that name, the Council of Aurealis once again gathered, this time, not to condemn humanity, but to plead for a new alliance. The representatives spoke of rebuilding trade, rebuilding trust and facing new threats together. Because deep in the dark of the outer rim, new signals were rising, signals of another power that had waited while the humans and Zorath tore each other apart. The first reports came from small colonies. Merchant ships gone missing, distress beacons found without survivors. Only empty hulls and strange marks burned into the metal. At first, some thought it was just pirates, but the patterns were too deliberate, too coordinated. Within weeks, whole settlements went dark. Entire families never heard from again. The news spread like fire across galactic networks. Whispers of a shadow empire not yet named. Some called them the Drosin. Others called them the Silent Hand, but no one really knew who they were, except that they were moving fast and they were not afraid of the humans. The council turned to Earth, hoping the same warriors who had destroyed the Dominion could rise again. But Laura and her crew knew something deeper was happening. They knew this enemy was not like the Zorath who fought with pride and fury. This new power moved with patience, precision, and silence. One evening aboard the ship, Laura gathered her officers in the strategy chamber. Daniel, her second-in-command, leaned forward, his hands pressed flat on the table. His eyes narrowed. If these reports are true, then we are facing something smarter than the Zorath, something that waits and watches before it strikes, he said. Amanda, the ship's engineer, shook her head, worry in her voice. What if they are testing us like hunters circling before the kill? Marcus, the youngest pilot, frowned, his usual humor absent. For once, you mean they could already be here watching us? Laura let the silence sit heavy before she answered. We do not wait to be hunted, we hunt first, she said, and in that moment her crew understood what was coming. Their mission was no longer about defense, it was about discovery. They needed to find out who the shadow enemy was before the galaxy fell into panic. So the humans began a new campaign, not of open war, but of silent movement into the unexplored corners of space. They boarded derelict ships, traced the burned patterns across hulls, studied fragments of weapons that did not belong to any known race. What they found chilled them to the bone. The marks were not random. They were a language, a form of writing etched with heat across steel. Laura called in specialists from Earth, linguists, cryptographers, even old professors who once studied extinct alien tongues. Weeks passed with no answer, until finally one voice broke through. Professor Grant, an old man with tired eyes, studied the symbols and said quietly, "This is not a new enemy. This is an old one." The room fell into stunned silence. He explained that centuries ago, before the council was even formed, there had been legends of the Veil Walkers, a species said to live between stars, not bound by normal space. Their existence was dismissed as myth stories told by traders to scare children. But the symbols matched the ancient fragments that described their passing. If the stories were true, then the Veil Walkers were older than any empire, older than Earth itself. Laura tightened her fists around the edge of the table. Myths or not, they are killing colonies, she said, and that means they are real now. The crew began to notice patterns whenever the walkers struck. They left behind silence. Not just destroyed ships, but erased records, communications cut, memory cores wiped. It was as if they wanted to erase proof of existence except for the marks they burned. As warnings, Daniel suggested they might be testing human resolve, perhaps even waiting to see if Earth would respond, and Earth did respond in ways no other species would have. The humans set traps across empty sectors. They left bait freighters wired with hidden trackers. They used old Earth tricks like coded broadcasts masked as static, hoping to lure the enemy out. It worked once in the cold stretch of space near Orion Belt. A shadow moved against the stars. The bait ship vanished, but the tracker pulsed for a brief moment. Before cutting off, Laura ordered full pursuit, and for the first time humanity saw a glimpse of the Veil Walkers, not a fleet, not an army, but one ship, sleek black like a shard of void itself. It moved without thrusters, without light, only bending space around it. Marcus whispered from his pilot seat, like, "It is made of the night itself," weapons locked, but before they could fire, the ship was gone. Not jumped, not cloaked, just gone as though it had never been. Laura's crew sat in stunned silence. No one spoke until Amanda muttered under her breath, "How do you fight a ghost?" The galaxy began to panic again. The council argued endlessly. Some said to surrender, others to retreat deeper into secure systems, but humanity did not speak. They acted. Colonies were fortified. Old war veterans returned. To duty, new ships rolled out of dry docks faster than ever before. Laura and her crew kept moving across the void, chasing every faint signal, every half-erased trail. What they learned was terrifying. The Veil Walkers did not conquer for land or resources. They harvested memory culture knowledge from every world they struck. Their victims were not just dead, they were forgotten. History burned with them as if the Veil Walkers wished to cleanse the galaxy of its past. The realization hit Laura hardest. Of all, humanity had become the galaxy's storytellers, the record keepers, the stubborn voices that refused to be silenced. And if the Walkers wanted to erase history, then humans were their greatest threat for weeks. Laura could not sleep her mind, turning over every possibility of how to fight an enemy that did not leave traces. One night she stood at the observation deck looking at the scattered stars when Daniel joined her. He said, "You carry this like it is only your burden." "But it is ours, too," Laura shook her head softly. "If we fail, the galaxy loses itself." Daniel placed a hand on the rail and said, "If we fail, we rise again, because that is what we do." And in that simple truth, Laura found her resolve. The next mission would not just be a hunt, it would be a message. Humans would show the galaxy that even shadows could be dragged into the light. Soon whispers spread across colonies and fleets. Humanity was preparing something new, not just weapons but stories. They began broadcasting, tales of their victories, their defeats, their survival. Every message carried one phrase: when humans repay a debt, entire galaxies tremble. It became a chant, a shield of words to fight the silence of the Walkers' colonies, once afraid, now repeated. Council worlds, once doubtful, began to hold on to it. Laura heard it echo across channels as if humanity's defiance was louder than fear. But she knew the real battle was still coming. The Walkers had tested the humans once. Now they would come again, and when they did, Laura promised herself they would not face shadows unprepared. They would drag the unseen into the light and prove that no ghost, no myth, no ancient predator could erase the will of humanity. The galaxy waited in fear, but Earth moved forward, not afraid of the debt, not afraid of the cost, and as Laura watched her crew prepare for the unknown, she whispered a quiet vow. "We will repay what we owe, and we will not tremble. We will make them tremble." The galaxy held its breath as the days passed and the name of the Veil Walkers spread from one system to another, whispered in fear and in doubt, and in endless questions. While some races wanted to hide and seal their worlds, others looked only to the humans because no one else seemed ready to fight the shadows. Laura Stone stood again at the center of her ship, her voice calm but her mind racing because every signal report and every lost colony weighed on her like stones. She had seen death before. But this was worse because the Veil Walkers did not only kill, they erased, and the thought of entire cultures being wiped from memory filled her with fire. Her crew stood with her, loyal and restless and waiting for the next step. Council sent envoys once more, trying to convince Earth to sit at the table. But humanity had stopped caring for speeches. They worked in the shadows of their own, building fleets, repairing ships, training soldiers, pushing every resource into preparation for a war no one else could understand. Daniel looked across the star maps and said, "They are moving closer. Each strike creeps toward the center worlds. They are not random." Amanda adjusted her screens and said, "They are circling us, drawing lines that look like a cage." Marcus leaned back and muttered, "Or like hunters closing in." Laura watched the glowing lines on the screen and felt the same chill she had once felt during the war with the Dominion. This was not chance. The Walkers were watching and shaping the battlefield. But the humans had learned from their last wars. They knew how to turn fear into a weapon. Laura gave the order to prepare the Beacon Project. The crew glanced at each other because they knew what that meant. Weeks before, Earth had begun building something new. Not a superweapon, not a fleet, but a trap that stretched across light years. They called it the Beacon Project, because at its core it was light, raw energy, amplified through stations hidden at key points in space, a weapon not to destroy but to reveal. Because if the Walkers lived in the folds of shadow, then humanity would flood those shadows with light. Each station would flare brighter than a star for seconds, enough to tear the veil away and expose whatever moved within. But to set the trap they needed bait, and no one argued when Laura volunteered her ship to be that bait. The plan was brutal. The Prometheus-class vessel would drift alone through an empty sector, broadcasting false codes as, though it was crippled while the walkers circled closer, then the beacons would fire and light the dark. Daniel tried to protest, saying, "Captain, you cannot risk everything." On this, Amanda added, "The ship cannot withstand a direct strike from something that erases entire fleets," Marcus muttered. "If they catch us, we are nothing but dust." But Laura looked at them and said simply, "If we do nothing, the galaxy will fade into silence. If we take this chance, then maybe the galaxy will see them and know they can bleed." So the plan moved forward. The weeks that followed stretched like years. The crew drilled again and again, running through every possible outcome, preparing for battles they might never return from outside the ship. Earth sent silent support fleets not to fight but to activate the beacons at her command. No one spoke of survival. They spoke only of the moment when the shadows would be pulled screaming into the light on the night before the mission. Laura walked the decks of her ship, speaking quietly to her crew. She told Marcus to trust his hands on the controls, to Daniel to trust his instincts, and to Amanda to trust the machine she had kept alive. Through countless battles, she did not give speeches. She only gave each of them a reminder that their fight was not just for Earth, but for every voice in the galaxy that feared being erased. The next day, the ship drifted into the void, silent, dark, as if it was dying. The distress codes echoed across the empty stars, and then silence. The crew sat at their stations, tension sharp, every breath held for what felt like hours, until Amanda's voice whispered, "I see them." No alarms sounded, nothing moved on the scanners, but the air felt heavy. Laura asked where Amanda pointed at the dark space beyond the glass of the bridge, not at a ship, but at the stars themselves, one by one, winking out as something vast moved between them. Marcus cursed under his breath. Daniel's jaw clenched. Amanda's hands shook as she said, "They are here." And then the shadows bent and a ship appeared, not sleek like the first they had seen, but massive. A leviathan of black metal bending light around it. Every instinct in Laura screamed to fire, but she held steady because the trap was not yet ready. The walker ship moved without sound. No signal, no hail. Only the crushing weight of presence, as though it was staring into their souls. Daniel muttered under his breath, "This thing is older than empires." And then it began to move, closer. Laura gave the order now, and the stars themselves ignited the beacon. Project roared to life across the void, flares of white fire exploding like newborn suns, streaks of energy tearing through the dark. The walker ship shimmered as though the shadows around it burned away. For the first time, the galaxy saw it clearly. Not myth, not ghost, but a construct of black and silver wings spreading wider than cities, etched with the same burning marks they left behind. Amanda gasped. Daniel whispered, "It is real." Marcus locked weapons, but the walker ship recoiled, vanishing in a blink, only to reappear further away, caught again in the flood of light like a predator dragged from hiding. Laura shouted fire, and for the first time, human weapons struck, true bolts of plasma slamming into the shadow hull, tearing pieces away. The walker ship screamed, not with sound, but with a pulse that rattled bones and froze minds across the crew. Amanda cried out. Daniel clutched the table. Marcus nearly lost control of the ship. But Laura stood firm, eyes locked on the enemy, and whispered, "You bleed." They fired again and again, each shot carving more pieces until the walker ship flickered one last time and tore itself back into the void, leaving only fragments. Drifting in the light, the crew sat in stunned silence. No one spoke until Marcus let out a broken laugh. "We hurt them." Laura exhaled, slow and steady. "We proved they can be touched across the galaxy." The recordings spread faster than any fire colonies that once whispered in fear now shouted in hope. The Veil Walkers bled, and the humans had shown it to everyone. The Council tried to claim credit, sending messages of unity and strength. But everyone knew the truth. The humans had dragged the ghost into the light and shown that it could fall. But Laura was not satisfied because she knew the fight was far from over. This was only one ship, one battle, and the walkers had many more. Yet the message mattered. The galaxy now had proof that the shadows could be resisted. Daniel said we gave them a wound, but wounds heal. Amanda added they will return. Marcus muttered. Then we do it again. Laura stood at the glass, her gaze fixed on the drifting fragments glowing in the beacon light. She whispered no. Next time we finish it. And the promise echoed in her crew because they all knew the war had only just begun, and humanity had once again taken the first step into the fire. The galaxy could not forget what had been seen in the light of the beacon, because for the first time in living memory, the myths of the Veil Walkers had been torn from shadows into reality, and the proof that they could bleed gave every world a fragile sense of hope. But hope alone was not enough because the Walkers were ancient and cunning, and they had never before been forced into the open, which meant their response would be terrible. Laura and her crew returned to Earth carrying fragments. Of the broken Walker ship, scientists and engineers studied the shards day and night, but what they found only deepened the fear. The fragments resisted every tool and every scan, bending light, bending heat as if they were alive. Amanda worked without rest trying to crack the pieces, her eyes red, her hands trembling as she said again and again, "It is not metal. It is something else. Something older." Daniel stood beside her watching the screens flicker. He muttered, "If we cannot understand it, we cannot fight it." But Laura silenced him with a steady voice. "We will understand it because we must across the colonies." Whispers rose louder than ever. Some believed the humans had doomed them all by provoking the shadows. Others believed the humans had saved them by proving the enemy was not invincible. The council floundered in endless debate, but Earth did not wait. Earth built and trained and pushed harder than ever before. Fleets expanded weapons, upgraded soldiers prepared for the war that everyone knew was coming. Marcus grew restless, flying endless patrols through quiet space, always muttering that the silence felt heavier than any battle because silence meant the Walkers were waiting. One night while Laura sat alone in her quarters, staring at the fragments, a call came through. It was Professor Grant, his voice calm but urgent. He said, "Captain, the fragments are not resisting us out of strength. They are resisting out of memory." She frowned, not understanding, and he explained they are not just material. They are records. The Walkers carved their history into their own flesh. The burning marks we see are not warnings. They are memories. And that means every piece we hold tells us who they are. Laura sat in silence, her mind racing. If that was true, then humanity had more than a weapon. They had a story. And in this war, stories mattered as much as fire. The research accelerated, and slowly the fragments began to reveal shapes and patterns that matched stars older than any empire. Lines of wars fought and worlds consumed, Amanda whispered as she pieced the images together. They have done this before. Again and again across ages. They erase and they erase, until nothing is left. Laura's stomach turned, but her resolve hardened, because now she knew the truth. This war was not about territory or resources, it was about memory itself. The Walkers wanted silence, but humans carried noise, voices, laughter, pain, songs, and records, and they would not give them up. Daniel stood in the command center and said, "Then we make it our weapon. We show them we cannot be erased." So humanity began something new. While ships and weapons were built, they also built voices across the networks. They poured out their history, their music, their failures, their victories, every culture of Earth joining into a storm of sound. They broadcast not just to colonies, but into the dark itself, daring the Walkers to come. Amanda called it the flood of noise. Marcus called it the wall of voices. Daniel simply called it defiance. Laura called it survival. Weeks passed and nothing happened. The voices poured. The fleets grew. The colonies waited. The silence stretched until doubt returned. Maybe the Walkers had retreated. Maybe they had vanished like ghosts into the dark, but Laura never believed it. She knew they were waiting, watching, choosing their moment, and she was right. One night the alarm screamed across 3 sectors at once. Colonies gone in minutes. Fleets struck before they could fire. Back the Walkers had returned, not with one ship, but with dozens black leviathans rising from shadow, tearing worlds apart. With silent precision, the galaxy trembled. Laura and her crew raced into the void, but even with the new fleets, they were outnumbered. Every battle left scars, ships shattered, people lost. But for the first time the enemy was seen clearly by many. Not just shadows, but ships caught in light ships that bled when struck. The humans fought with fury. Daniel shouted orders. Marcus flew. Like fire, Amanda kept the ship alive when it should have died again and again. Laura stood at the center, holding her crew together through storms of flame and shadow. One battle burned through the skies of a colony called Haven. The Walker fleet descended, erasing city after city, but the humans stood their ground, not retreating, not surrendering, broadcasting their voices even as the fire fell. The colonists sang old Earth songs over the comms. Children shouted names of heroes. Soldiers carved messages into walls, knowing they would be wiped but leaving their marks anyway. And when the walkers swept over them, the humans struck back with every ounce of fury. The beacon project flared again, dragging the walkers into the light. The humans bled them again and again, not enough to destroy them, but enough to prove that silence would not win. Daniel shouted over the chaos, "We will not be erased." Amanda cried, "The ship cannot take more." Marcus screamed, "Let me fly into them." Laura raised her, voice steady and strong. "Not yet. We fight, we endure, we hold," and they did. The Battle of Haven lasted 3 days and 3 nights, until the skies were fire and the ground was ash. But in the end, the walkers pulled back, leaving behind wreckage and fragments, but not victory. Laura stood on the bridge, exhausted, her crew bruised and battered. Daniel said, "We survived." Amanda whispered barely. Marcus muttered, "They will be back." Laura looked at the stars beyond the smoke and said, "Then we will be ready." When the reports spread across the galaxy, the message was clear. Humanity could not be silenced. The Council tried again to claim control, but no one listened. The colonies no longer looked to politics. They looked to Earth. They looked to the soldiers who had stood at Haven, and they whispered the phrase again: "When humans repay a debt, entire galaxies tremble." Laura knew the debt was far from settled. She knew the walkers would come again, stronger, fiercer, determined to erase what defied them, but she also knew humanity had found something no shadow could erase: unity across worlds, across species. Voices joined, not in fear but in defiance. Amanda leaned against her console and whispered, "Sometimes, I think we will not win." Laura looked at her and said softly, "Maybe not, but we will make sure the galaxy remembers us, even if it costs everything." Daniel nodded. Marcus smirked and said, "Then let us give them something they cannot forget." And so the war continued, the walkers in their silence, the humans in their noise, every battle tearing the galaxy apart every day, pushing closer to the final reckoning. Because Laura and her crew knew there would be a day when silence and noise would clash for the last time, and when that day came, they swore humanity would stand in the center, unbroken, unyielding, unforgotten. The galaxy held its breath in a silence that was louder than any cannon, because every world knew what was coming. The final reckoning between humanity and the Veil Walkers. A war older than memory itself. Laura Stone stood on the bridge of her flagship, her eyes scanning the stars beyond the veil, and in every shadow, she felt the presence of the enemy she had prepared for this day for years. Every ship, every soldier, every strategy leading to this moment. Daniel stood beside her, his hands gripping the railing, his jaw tight but his eyes calm. They had trained for months, for years, some without sleep, without rest, watching every system, every colony, knowing that the walkers would strike with everything they had, and that when they came, they would not stop. They would attempt to erase everything. Every song, every history, every world, but humanity had learned to fight differently. Not only with weapons, but with defiance. Marcus paced at the controls, his usual humor gone, replaced by a focus sharper than any blade. He muttered, "Every time the shadows move, they think they can take us, but they are wrong." Amanda monitored the shields and power flows, her hands steady as they danced across the panels. Every system operating at maximum capacity. Every cannon loaded, every beacon ready. The flood of voices broadcast across the void had reached every corner of the galaxy, carrying stories, music, knowledge, history, every bit of culture that humanity could send, so that when the walkers came, they would meet a wall of memory and sound that could not be erased, and the stars themselves seemed to hum with it. The first warning came as a ripple through space, a distortion that twisted light and gravity, as if the stars themselves bent in response. Every sensor on the flagship screamed something was moving faster than thought, faster than light itself. And then they appeared dozens, hundreds. A storm of black leviathans rising from the void, twisting shadows around them. The fleet tensed, every gun locked, every ship ready. But even as they fired, the walkers seemed untouchable, until Laura gave the order to activate the beacons. And across the sectors, every hidden station flared bright as newborn suns. The light tore through the shadows, revealing the enemy in shapes massive and alien. Each ship trembling as human fire struck true, not enough to destroy them, but wound enough to show they were mortal. The battle was endless blasts and counters weaving like a storm through space. Jason led his squadron into the heart of the storm, weaving through shadows, firing plasma at ships that seemed like solid night. Mark is flanking on his wing, dodging black tendrils that seemed to reach out for the living. Daniel coordinated fleet movements like a chess master, moving pieces across a board too large to see from any one point. Amanda patched the flagship together, as it shuddered under attacks that should have destroyed it. Clara led medics across vessels, treating soldiers injured by blasts that burned not only metal but morale. Yet every human held their line, their will, their defiance. The walkers could not understand it. They had encountered civilizations before, but none that fought not only to live but to be remembered. The flood of human voices, carried through comms and through space, not for commands, but as proof that they existed, songs of Earth. Tales of heroism. Even messages from children, scared but unbroken, echoed across the void. Each one a reminder that the enemy could not erase what had life. The battle stretched across light years. Fleets collided and separated, weaving patterns of fire and shadow. No one could rest because the walkers adapted with every strike, adjusting their formations, moving faster than thought. But the humans had anticipated it. They learned to anticipate shadows, to predict the patterns, to feed the enemy false trails. While strengthening their main lines, the first breakthrough came when Amanda shouted, "Shields down, but firepower optimal." Laura seized the moment and gave the order to concentrate all energy on one corridor through the walker formation. Every cannon, every missile, every beacon burst in unison. The light tore a path through the enemy like a blade through silk. The leviathans shrieked in waves that rattled the ships, yet they could not vanish fast enough. The humans struck, tearing massive holes in the ranks, and fragments of black ships drifted into the void. The enemy faltered, and for the first time, the galaxy saw that the shadows could be wounded. Yet the cost was immense. Vessels were lost faster than could be replaced. Thousands of soldiers fell even as their sacrifice ensured the survival of hundreds of thousands others. Still, Daniel coordinated counterattacks as he muttered under his breath, "We are paying the debt." Laura's eyes burned as she saw Marcus dive into the thick of the enemy's formation, dodging beams and tendrils and emerging with damaged ships saved and survivors rescued. She whispered, "Not everyone would survive, but enough would remember." Clara moved across stations, treating bodies broken in ways she had never imagined, yet every time a hand grasped hers in thanks, she knew the debt was being repaid. Every soul they saved became a story, every survivor a beacon. The battle reached a turning point when the human flagship itself, the vessel of Laura's command, pushed through the heart of the walker formation, broadcasting the flood of voices at full power. A wave of energy unlike anything before, washing across the enemy, not destroying them, but exposing them to the light that was life itself. And the leviathans recoiled, their black forms flickering as if burned by memory, because humans carried not only ships and weapons, but proof of existence. Every song, every story, every memory struck them harder than any plasma blast. They tried to strike back, yet every strike was met with defiance, even as Laura felt the ship shudder under the blows. She raised her voice, calm and fierce, "We do not surrender," and every officer, soldier, and crew member echoed the sentiment across channels. The final assault was chaos beyond comprehension. Ships spinning, lasers cutting void, explosions tearing across space. Yet through it, humanity pressed forward because they knew the galaxy depended on them, and when the last wave of the walkers surged forward, Laura gave the order she had waited for. Concentrate all energy, fire all weapons, every ship, every cannon, every missile, every beacon. The combined energy struck the core of the largest leviathan, tearing through armor, shield, and dark matter like it was paper. The ship screamed a soundless scream across the void. its fragments scattering, its memory disrupted for the first time in eons. The Walker fleet faltered as the humans pushed with unyielding will, every strike another wound. Every movement a reminder that the shadows could be hurt, and finally, after hours that stretched like days, the remaining Leviathans pulled back, disappearing into the void, not destroyed but battered, humbled and exposed for the galaxy to see. Laura's fleet hung in space, smoke and fragments drifting around them. Battered and bloodied but unbroken, Daniel whispered, "We did it." Amanda let out a long sigh. Marcus laughed with relief. Clara wept softly for the fallen, yet she smiled at the living. Laura stood on the bridge, looking at the stars beyond the debris, knowing the battle had ended. But the war was never truly over yet. In that moment, the galaxy knew something extraordinary. Humans had fought not for conquest, not for greed, not for glory, but because a promise had been made, a debt had been repaid, and the entire galaxy had felt the tremor of that defiance, and messages poured across every system from every survivor. When humans repay a debt, entire galaxies tremble, colonies rebuilt, fleets restored, history preserved. The Council stood humbled and awed. The Walkers would return someday, but they had learned the most important lesson. No enemy, no matter how ancient, could erase the will of humanity. And Laura Stone turned to her crew, her eyes weary but shining with fire. "We survived." "We," she said, and Daniel nodded. Marcus smiled. Clara smiled, Amanda whispered, and together they all knew humanity had become more than a species. They had become a force, a memory, a story no one could erase. And in the silence of the void, as stars burned brightly and fragments of the shadows drifted away, humanity carried forward, unbroken, unyielding, unforgettable. A beacon across galaxies, and as long as humans stood, no debt would ever go unpaid, no story would ever be silenced, and every corner of the universe would tremble if ever the debt was called upon again.